Troy Trojan Vision presents the 2016 campaign, featuring political science experts from the Troy University faculty, with an in-depth look at the 2016 presidential campaign. The panelists include Dr. Stephen L. Taylor, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and an expert in electoral and comparative politics, as well as Latin American politics. He is the author of 3 books. Dr. Taylor's most recent book, A Different Democracy, American Government in a 31-Country Perspective, was published by the Yale University Press in 2014. Dr. Marianne Stevenson specializes in American politics and immigration law. She has a PhD from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and a JD from the University of Memphis. She is currently working on a book manuscript on immigration. She is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Troy University. The moderator is Dr. Michael O. Slobodchikoff, who specializes in relations between Russia and the former Soviet states, international conflict and peace, and comparative politics. He is the author of 2 books. His most recent book, Building Hegemonic Order Russia's Way, Rule Stability and Predictability in a Post-Soviet Space, was published in 2014. He is a regular contributor to Russia Direct and has often served as an analyst on Russian relations with Ukraine for BBC World News, as well as Voice of Russia Radio. He is an assistant professor of political science at Troy University.
Welcome, everybody. The election is getting ever closer. We've had all 3 debates now, and they have gone extremely, interesting, to put it mildly. I want to ask our distinguished panel how much the debates actually will change public opinion.
Well, the debates typically don't tend to change public opinion too much. What we often see is voters tend to go into the debates already with their minds made up. So barring some type of unforeseen discussion or something like that, which is extremely rare during a debate, we don't tend to see extreme shifts in public opinion after the debates, and certainly we have not seen, we haven't really seen significant shifts in public opinion following the debates this go around as well.
And do we see more focus on style versus substance in the debates? I'm thinking of Trump interrupting a lot, or the fact that the 2 candidates never shook hands and obviously don't like each other very much. Is that mostly what we see in the debates in terms of character? Or?
Well, I think the debates this go around have been focused a lot more on style rather than substance or policy than we've seen traditionally in the past, and maybe that's captured a little bit by the fact that Trump is not a politician, has not been elected to public office, so he doesn't really have a policy history that we can focus on. So yes, certainly in this debate cycle, we have seen a lot more focus on non-policy types of issues during the debates, as well as with regard to media coverage. So, for example, a lot more focus on things like the email server and Trump's relationship with women and things like that, rather than actually seeing a focus on their policies. And
I want to take 1 second to talk about a couple of the answers that I found extremely interesting. There was a discussion, I believe it was in the second debate, about where Trump was talking, and he said, one of my first actions will be to appoint a special prosecutor and put you in jail, basically. You will be in jail during my administration. What should that say to the public in terms of something from the debate? Was that grandstanding? Was that something to be taken seriously? Is that problematic?
Well, I think it was a traditional Trumpism, if you will. Trump is a lot less polished than a lot of candidates that we've seen historically, and a lot of what comes out of his mouth is sort of off the cuff, to the dismay of his campaign strategists and advisors. And I think this was an example of one of those times when, he just kind of opened his mouth and, what I don't remember the exact line, but it was something to the effect of, you'd be in jail or,
Right.
Something like that. But certainly.
No, I think one, it shows the kind of thing that debates often, especially these debates, bring forth. It really becomes the soundbite that makes it the evening news, the thing that gets discussed. And quite clearly, this set of debates has not been especially heavy on policy, as I think we talked about last time. That particular event, and then certainly later when he pointed out that he wasn't going to say whether he was going to accept the election results in the third debate, are both examples of Mr. Trump. I think I think two things you said are correct. It may be off the cuff, but I think it's also important. He clearly, I don't think, plans these things out. Although he has taken the idea of her being in jail. Well, it goes back to the convention would lock her up.
Right.
And then this week he's talked about that she shouldn't even be allowed to run because of alleged crimes and things of this nature. The problem with that statement, and I think it's very significant, the problem with that statement is it violates fundamental democratic norms. We don't expect candidates who lose to face prosecution. Now, the charitable interpretation of his statement was when he said he'd appoint a special prosecutor is if he thinks she's in fact committed crimes that need to be investigated, that's not in and of itself illegitimate, although it's an odd time to make that kind of statement because it does have this sort of threat, if I win, then I'll use the force of the law against you. And then he did go on to say, if I were president, you'd be in jail, which is to go beyond the notion of investigation to I'll imprison you, which is especially troublesome. And then we throw in the other issue, which is, will he respect the election? And while on the one hand, it's mostly a tradition or a norm that losers concede, and if losers don't concede, it doesn't mean that the legal process doesn't go forward. It does, but it does create substantial difficulties in the society when one group of voters believes that maybe their candidate was illegitimately denied office. Ironically, the best examples that I can come up with lately is in Mexico a couple of years ago when a very close election took place and the loser did not concede for months. It didn't stop the president from being sworn in. It did create some short-term political problems. But given Mr. Trump's interest in Mexico, it's sort of an odd comparison in my mind, but nonetheless.
Well, and in the election of 2000, we had a situation where in the evening early, we had Florida flip-flop, and we had Gore initially conceding and then withdrawing that concession and fighting it out in the courts. If we do have a situation where Trump is questioning the results and actually trying to sue various states about their election results or to do this, and this ends up in the Supreme Court, what could happen with the court making a decision, the way it did in Bush v. Gore?
I think one way to draw a very, very significant distinction between what happened in 2000 and what Mr. Trump's done to this point. It's one thing to come to an election, have a close election, and then contest the legality of the count. That's perfectly legitimate. In a very close election, there are legal thresholds that have to be overcome, and there's a process that can be undertaken. And one can go back and either critique or praise the 2000 process, but that was perfectly legitimate. Mr. Gore did not say 3 weeks before the election, I don't know if I'm going to respect the outcome. Rather, he did concede initially and then decided to step back, which was within his right because at that point, those of us that remember staying up very late that night, that became a remarkably tight election, and then it became legitimate to then have a legal challenge. Mr. Trump's not saying that. He's not saying, of course I'll accept the results of the election unless it's close, at which point I'll take my rights, legal rights, and then proceed with them. He's just saying, I don't know, I'll let you know whether I'm going to respect the outcome or not.
If he wins, he will.
Yeah, but if he wins, he will, which of course is its own sort of negative statement. Now, if it goes to the Supreme Court, which, well, I guess I'll put it this way, it seems radically unlikely that we'll have anything of that nature go going forward. But if it does, it'll be very interesting since we have a 4-4 court, and that would make things complicated.
I think what makes the situation a little bit different too, going along with the point that you made about the Bush-Gore dynamic, is that in this situation we have a candidate who is also putting out claims that the election is rigged, and certainly neither Gore nor Bush obviously made those types of allegations either prior or after the election took place. So, this allegation that the election is rigged, and regardless of, by how much I lose, I'm still will consider contesting the election, and I'm going to, consider not conceding the election. Is something almost, certainly is unprecedented, and is something that makes this a little bit different than what we saw in 2000.
I think it can't be stressed enough that the way that candidates behave during a democratic process matters. And specifically the candidates. Now we think back to 2000, there were Gore surrogates or Gore allies that raised questions about either Governor Bush, Jeb Bush in Florida, or the Secretary of State, whose name escapes me right now, and others that made, in some cases, I'm sure if you did a Google search, you could find some pretty,
Catherine Harris, I think.
I think you're correct, some pretty substantial rhetorical claims. But those are allies. If Gore himself had said, this is rigged, this is not fair, this is illegitimate, then that's a signal to all of his voters that this process is somehow corrupted and not democratic. And therefore, because the whole point about democracy is, to paraphrase a famous political scientist who once said that democracy is simply a system by which we settle conflict by not killing one another. I mean, that sounds flippant, but if you really think about history, it's not, right? We create a set of rules by which we contest power, and then we accept the outcomes, assuming the outcomes are done appropriately. Now, there are plenty of problems with any human system, and so American elections, there are flaws. It's not 100% perfect, although speaking as someone that studies elections, though, it does a pretty good job. There are lots of things that could be done better, but there's really no evidence, and lots of people have studied this, that there are any kind of substantial flaws in the system. And for Mr. Trump to make these claims inflames his voters and his supporters in a way that's not healthy for a democracy. And then the ladle on top of that, you should be in jail. The ladle on top of that, I don't know if I'm going to concede. This is a whole different category, and as Dr. Stevenson says correctly, it is unprecedented in American politics at this major level. And it really is comparable to what we would see in developing countries with highly underdeveloped democracies or that don't even have democracies. That's the kind of behavior we would expect. So this is extremely troubling, regardless of any other position one might have about these candidates. That behavior, I think, is very problematic.
Well, and I want to build upon that. He's recently talked about certain urban centers, Philadelphia especially, in terms of voter fraud, and that if he doesn't win the election, it's because dead people are voting in Philadelphia, people are voting more than once, etc. And he's asked his supporters to go out to the polling places to actually monitor this. And are we going to see violence or voter suppression or things like that by some of his followers who are going to monitor the election and are convinced that there's voter fraud occurring?
Well, our electoral system is certainly it operates and it operates much like our federalist system in that the elections operate on a state level. And then underneath that, they also operate and have separate rules on a county-to-county level. So each of the 50 states plus Washington, D.C., in the individual counties all have separate electoral rules. That's what makes it also difficult when we hear claims that the election, for example, is rigged, because there are so many rules and so many layers that a campaign would have to infiltrate in order to actually rig an entire presidential election, contrary to popular shows like Scandal,
Right.
for example, or something like that. So it would be very difficult for a presidential election to actually be rigged, and even more difficult to actually prove it. But going back to your actual question, certainly there are people do have obviously the First Amendment right to assemble, but the individual states can also do have the right to restrict where and how individuals actually choose to exercise that right. So, for example, people may be forced to, have a certain a barrier with regard to how close they can be to a polling station, the types of information that they're allowed to present. But certainly the candidates, or I should say, individuals from both sides can certainly appear at a polling station in order to ensure that there's nothing nefarious going on. But in terms of actually any type of voter suppression or any type of tactics that are designed to keep voters from actually being able to go inside is something that the state, I believe the individual states will and the individual counties will work hard to keep that from actually happening.
Okay.
I hope that actual confrontation is unlikely. Certainly violence I don't think is likely. What concerns me is the basic allegations have this clear racial tinge to them. And to suggest that voters in urban areas who might be predominantly African American are somehow behaving in a nefarious way is problematic. And to sort of even suggest that people should go out and monitor sort of ad hoc. Dr. Stevenson is correct. There are volunteers from the parties that can be official poll watchers, and that's a legitimate and an important part of the process. But to sort of ask people to ad hoc show up to look around to see what people are doing is not appropriate in my opinion. And really, we've all been to polling places. The ability of some random person to see really whether any voter fraud is going on is essentially zero. And another thing about your question that I think is worth commenting upon, what I note, because again, this is an area that I pay a special attention to, part of the things that Mr. Trump and some of his surrogates are saying fall out in maybe two categories. One is more internet memes and forwarded emails than actual solid information. It's almost as if they look at Facebook and then decide to make these claims, which are often incorrect or highly inaccurate. Or in some cases, he has made some claims that have some truth to them. There are dead people who are registered, but let's think about what that means. It means they've died and the rolls have not been expunged. There's a difference between saying there are in fact people who are technically still registered and actually having dead people show up and vote. I don't mean zombies, I mean people impersonating them. And we have so little evidence, and there's been of that actually happening. I know that there are time-worn stories, Chicago, South Texas, to go back decades. Yes, things happened in the distant past, but that was under a very different circumstance where you could stuff ballot boxes with literally stuff them with ballots and no one be able to take care of that. It's a different circumstance now.
And we've been warned now of Russian hacking attempts. How likely is it that they would try to hack in and influence our election that way? Is that probable or possible?
The degree to which the information is on machines that are hackable, I think, is somewhat questionable. Many of the machines are not. It's not like all the ballot boxes are connected to the internet. Now, I suppose you can construct scenarios in which there could be outside influence, but this strikes me more as spy novel territory than reality. I think the real possibility of influence we've already seen, which is it's much easier to hack into someone's email account, right, find potentially embarrassing information, and share it in a way that affects the news cycle. In that sense, I think we've already seen attempts to influence the election, or at least to mess with it, for lack of a more sophisticated term. But I don't see that there's any reason to assume that the actual voting would be somehow directly hacked.
Yeah, and there's just, as I mentioned before, there's so many different levels, and certainly a lot of the states utilize some type of a mail-in system. Colorado, for example, only utilizes a mail-in system. So there are so many different layers that would have to be infiltrated that I think it would be very difficult
Close to impossible.
to do.
I think that, and Dr. Stevens mentioned it several times, and it's worth saying one more time. This system is complicated, it's multi-layered. The ability to infiltrate it and no one spilled the beans, is just, it's almost Area 51, they're aliens, their territory, to say that's what's going to happen. This is not something that we should have to worry, that we have any reason to worry about.
Okay, good. I want to turn to the actual current prognostication about the Electoral College. Currently, Clinton is slightly leading in North Carolina, Florida, Ohio maybe, although Ohio's a toss-up. Clinton's pretty far ahead in terms of the Electoral College, still within about 6 percentage points in terms of the popular vote. What strikes you as interesting or something that we should follow as the election results come in?
Well, I find what's going on in Texas and Arizona to be extremely interesting, and those are the two that I'm, paying a lot of attention to, and that's largely because of, that's my area of interest and research is on immigration policy. So what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, or the last week or so, with regard to Texas and Arizona, is we've seen Texas shifting from a state that has been traditionally a very strong red state to now, being borderline, possibly leaning blue. And the same with regard to Arizona, and that's interesting because you've got changing demographics in both of the states. Certainly, obviously in Texas. In Arizona, you also have a very high number of Mormons and a fairly significant number of Native Americans as well, who traditionally have not been. Have not turned out to vote in huge numbers, but we've seen the Clinton campaign really rallying those individuals to not only register to vote, but also get out and vote. So to me, what's going on in those two states is new and also fairly exciting to watch.
Yeah, I think first off, and I think we talked about this maybe in our first session this year, the electoral math is tilted to some degree toward Democrats for a variety of reasons that we don't have time to fully get into right now. So that Mr. Trump was facing a particularly challenging pathway, although it was more than possible, or a generic Republican was facing a particular pathway. This is substantially tightened in the last, several weeks in particular, because for Mrs. Clinton to win, she can have a lot of bad things happen on election night and still win. For Mr. Trump to win, he's got to have a number of extremely positive things happen. He's got to win Florida, he's got to win North Carolina, he's got to win probably Virginia, Ohio, Arizona, states that currently are not looking at all in his favor. And Dr. Stevens is correct, there's some very interesting things to watch. I think one, if you're watching it and Mrs. Clinton has won North Carolina, Virginia, you can, whether that makes you relax or makes you upset, once that's happened, it's pretty much a set and done deal. But for election nerds such as myself, whether Arizona goes blue, again, regardless of preferences for outcome of the election, that's a fascinating outcome because it's been a deep red state, or a pretty red state, maybe not deep.
Last time it voted for Clinton.
Yeah, 96.
96.
And it would be significant if it went blue. If Texas even trends toward, right now the most recent polls do show it within a few points. That's pretty remarkable. Likewise, there was some discussion that Georgia could also fall in that category. I think it's firmed a little more Trumpish in the last couple of weeks. The state that I think is the most interesting from a totally abstract, because it doesn't have any effect on the outcome, is Utah. Mr. Trump is not popular with Mormons. And obviously Utah is a heavily Mormon state. And so we have this independent candidate, Evan McMullen, who is on the ballot, I think in 11 states, and is on a write-in for several others. But he's definitely on the ballot in Utah. He's from Utah, he's a Mormon, he's a former CIA intelligence analyst, and is a conservative Republican in his own background. He worked for in the Congress. And he is trending upward in Utah. And this could create one of two very interesting outcomes. One, Utah could go for Clinton because there would be just enough splitting of the vote that Clinton could win Utah, or he could win Utah. Either one of those things is a massive repudiation to the Republicans' nominee and does signal that there are truly these internal problems within the Republican Party that they're going to have to address one way or another going forward. It could also influence, I guess, the vote in Idaho, which also has a very heavy Mormon population, and of course in Arizona as well. So it's a very interesting dynamic. So we could see, and it becomes pure trivia, but it would be the first time that a state has voted for their electoral votes for a non-major party candidate going back to the 1960s. So, it's sort of interesting in that way, and those of us that watch this stuff find that fun, but I don't know that ultimately, it matters, I think, for the party. It doesn't matter for the outcome of the election.
It's November 9th. Who's won?
We're back to that. No, I think that unless the polling is totally wrong, and there's no evidence to suggest that it is, we do go every cycle we go through, people will say that it's this year's different, right? If you're losing. The losing side always says, this year polling could be wrong. There's no reason to think that it is. And Mr. Trump has not, as we talked about last time, invested the money, the ground game. I don't see how he wins. So I assume that the winner, therefore, is Mrs. Clinton. But, we still have 2 weeks to go or whatever.
Whatever. I have been wary thus far.
Yes, you have.
To double down on a candidate, but at this point, based on the polling that we're seeing, I am comfortable agreeing with Dr. Taylor. I think absent something that just has not been captured in the polls, or absent some very unusual scandal or something coming out this late in the game, I think it would be very difficult for Mr. Trump to eke out a win at this point.
I agree with both of you. I think that the most interesting thing will be what happens in the individual states. Will Arizona go blue? And some of the down ballot initiatives. Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Maricopa County, for example, who's been a lightning rod in terms of immigration. Will he be reelected and put in jail soon after? Or not?
Who controls the Senate?
Who controls the Senate?
What actually happens to the House, which seems likely to remain Republican, but with less seats? What becomes the behavior of the parties after all this is over with? Because even though we all want to say, "We'll be glad when it's over with," it's not over with, right? Then whoever wins control of the chambers has to find a way to work together, and there doesn't seem to be a massively positive prospect for substantial working together. Indeed, the opposite would seem to be the case. The system is going to empower minorities in the House caucus for the Republicans, and the Republicans, if they're in the minority, or the Democrats in the minority in the Senate, can block. It's going to be very difficult to govern. And the Republicans are going to have to figure out what to do next, and that's not easy.
And even a Supreme Court nominee.
Yes.
So.
Or more.
Or more.
Yeah. Or more, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining us.
To watch this and other programs on our YouTube page, go to youtube.com/Troy Trojan Vision. To find out when programs will be televised, like us on Facebook.